Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cashflow King with you, and with me today, I have a very special guest, Cube Crusher, to talk to you about how the Cashflow King and Cube Crusher probably lost over $160,000. This is going to be a tough one. Before we get into today's show, I want to give a very special quick shout out to our newest premium subscriber, Brandon A., who got involved with us over the holiday season. So we sent him the backlog of all the Cashflow Kings picks and the quarterly e-newsletters. He now has access to all the shows in the archives. We'll have another premium podcast coming out to talk about the Q4 newsletter, which Cube Crusher will be getting for us here shortly. So very special thank you to Brandon A. for joining the premium members of the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. Unfortunately, he did get in a little bit after, just after we had done the drawing for the $100 for $25 gift cards, which happened to go out to the folks that won for some dominoes. But we do plan to do that periodically and kind of as a surprise. So anybody that's a premium subscriber at the time that we do that will be eligible and entered in to win. We still have 38 countries. Wanted to give a few quick shout-outs to some areas here in the United States, though, that are coming up on the listenership charts. First off, we have Lowell, Mass. is climbing up. We have Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then one that I've not seen before that kind of shot up out of nowhere, Boardman, Oregon. So thank you to all of our listeners, but especially those in Lowell, Mass., Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Boardman, Oregon for listening to the show. All right, we're going to start doing this every time I have Cube Crusher on. Now that we're in the season of sports betting, we're going to do a quick tip on sports bets, and I have really nothing to add except for I learned my lesson, and my one piece of advice would be no parlays. Cube, welcome to the show. Any comments on our sports betting tips? Do you have a new one?
Yeah, parlays are for fucking losers. That's all they advertise to you. They give you free bets for parlays and all that shit. Yeah, you can get lucky and hit one every once in a while. I actually did last night. I don't do parlays very often, but just figured I'd throw out a little fun bet and got lucky. But yeah, stay away from parlays. They're a very bad drug.
All right, so that's our financial advice on the show. As always, as we've always said, this is for entertainment, for education, ideas, information. We don't give advice on the show except for do not bet parlays. Unless you just get addicted like I did for a little while and you just have to throw a little something out there, a little sprinkler bet from time to time. But don't bet anything overly significant on parlays because you're probably never going to see that money again. Which is a great segue into today's show. There's what we're going to talk about today. I would say, first off, that there is definitely power in being vulnerable. So Cube and I talked about this a little bit before the show, and being willing to come on and do the show. I think that the title itself is going to catch a lot of attention, but we're not doing that just as clickbait. This is actually something that is really going on. And I thought it would be helpful and valuable to all of you as our listeners to hear from us, folks that like to think that, you know, we have more than a half a brain when it comes to investing. And we're going to tell you a little bit about how a couple of particular investments that are related went down. We are not going to mention the company name or names on the show because we are going to put this out as a general show. I don't yet know if we'll end up doing something different for our premium subscribers, depending on the feedback we get. We might disclose to them who it is that we're talking about, but I really don't know that that does anybody any favors anyway. And so this is just an effort for us to communicate, again, what we're going through, what led up to this, kind of the mess we're in right now, and then lessons learned going forward. So we have a whole kind of outline prepared for today's show. And again, I think that there's definitely power in being vulnerable because even the quote-unquote people that you think might have it all figured out, everybody makes mistakes, and sometimes things can go wrong. And so that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to start with the first bullet point, and then I'm going to turn it over to Cube for most of the second one. The first thing that I wanted to mention, there's different podcasts out there. Obviously, you guys know that because you're listening to our show, and we appreciate that, the Real Talk Personal Finance podcast. there's a lot of different types of podcasts, and you'll probably notice if you are a consumer of, and we both are consumers of personal finance related podcasts, specifically in my case for real estate investors, there's a tendency for certain groups and certain companies and organizations and names to sort of run around what I like to call the real estate podcast circuit. So you may have certain guests that appear on multiple shows, and good or bad, right or wrong, that has a tendency, at least in my opinion, to start to build some credibility as to whomever that might be. So if it's a certain company that's on a handful of different shows, investment shows, real estate related podcasts, things like that, and you hear them on different podcasts, all of a sudden, at least in my mind, they start to build a little bit of credibility. You get a little bit curious. You start to feel like you might know them a little bit. Sometimes you start to trust a little bit. And that's kind of sort of how I got involved with the investment funds that we're going to talk about today, is initially from hearing a particular group on several different podcasts. Now, at the time, I think Cube and I don't know if we were really hanging out as much or talking as much at the time, but I got involved with these first initially. And then I remember we were hanging out one day and kind of catching up, and I think obviously we talk about finances and shit. So this happened to come up, and I'll let him tell his side of the story. But from my viewpoint, he took an interest in this, and this is something that I had looked into before making the investment, something that presumably he also looked into before making the investment. And we're going to kind of unravel the story here as we go. So that's how I got introduced to what we're going to talk about today, and we're not trying to be evasive. Our second bullet point, I'm going to turn it over to Cube here in a second, is what types of investments we're actually talking about, and these are real estate note funds, which can come in different varieties. But Cube, if you want, go ahead and catch the listeners up as to sort of what we're talking about and why this might be appealing or was appealing and attractive to us and many other investors.
Yeah, so I guess I can't even remember what year it was that I put in my initial investment. It was probably at least 5 or more years ago into the first fund. And it was attractive to me, I guess, just because at that point in time, interest rates were super low. You weren't getting anything on treasuries, you weren't getting anything on your bank account, you weren't getting anything on savings account, etc. The stock market, it's still running significantly since pretty much 2008, 2009 when the stock market crash happened. So I guess there was maybe thoughts that, I have a lot of money invested in the stock market already. It's kind of keeps going up and up. Maybe to diversify a little bit into something that isn't directly correlated with the stock market or with my current investment strategy. And the fund offered a very attractive yield. Essentially, the first fund was 1% per month, so you got 12% per year on whatever your investment amount was. So just for the purposes of easy math, you put $1,000 in, then you're going to get $120 over the course of a year. You're going to get $10 a month.
That's exactly what I did, by the way. This started off as a joke. Sorry to interrupt you, but I called it the large cheese pizza because it was almost something that you really couldn't believe. Like, hey, I'm going to put $1,000 in this thing, and I'm going to get basically, what is it, $10 a month roughly. And so it was like, oh, well, they actually paid, and they actually paid again and again. But anyway, continue.
Yeah. So it is a real estate note fund, not like you mentioned, not specifically a real estate fund. A note fund is more investing in these loans. They were investing in what they call non-performing loans. Basically, people weren't paying their loans, and whatever company had bought them at the time were looking to offload them. This company, or fund, I guess I should call it, buys them for pennies on the dollar, so to speak, and then tries to get the loans performing or do whatever they can to get return for their investors. That's how they were able to produce this type of return, or more like a distribution that they gave to investors. And yeah, it was going well for the first several years. The distributions were paying out timely every month. Everything was going well. They actually started another fund with a slightly lower return that was, heck, I can't even remember now.
10.
Yeah, I think it was 10%. Yeah. So, and almost something like that, it kind of scares you a little bit because you're like, well, okay, well, I guess it shouldn't scare you, but it gives you a little more trust, which scares you as to put more money in. So they closed the first fund offering 12 and then offered 10 because rates continued to be low. And actually, I think they went even lower than what they were before. So they were able to get investors even at a 10% rate. So that, as an investor, that kind of makes you think, okay, well, they know what they're doing. They've done well enough on this fund that they can start another fund. Come to find out, hell, who knows? The whole thing could be a Ponzi scheme. And they opened another fund to get money to pay the other fund off. Who the hell knows what they're doing? But yeah, so I think as an investor, when you see something like that, you're like, oh, well, things must be going well. I'm getting paid my distribution every month. They're starting a new fund, et cetera, et cetera. So, that, I guess, continued to build the confidence, like you said, in this fund and in the person that was running the fund.
Yeah, so let me just elaborate a little bit on some of that stuff. Everything Cube said is correct. Now, with these non-performing loans that were purchased for pennies on the dollar, these are loans that are essentially tied to an asset, in this case, real estate, actual homes. And these are in different areas. They weren't necessarily concentrated in one particular state or one particular city. There's clusters of them essentially across the country. And so the idea is that, hey, there's kind of a social component to this, a social sustainability component where you can do well by doing good, as some people like to say. So you can invest your money as an investor, and all of a sudden you get somebody that's in a home that, for one reason or another, has fallen on hard times, really can't afford it. But because this fund bought those loans for such a strong discount, that company can then go ahead and negotiate with those homeowners and do some sort of a loan modification to try to get them to stay in their home. Maybe they're reducing the interest rate. Maybe they're lowering the payment. Maybe they're asking, hey, you owe X number of dollars in missed mortgage payments. We're going to go ahead and true it up and wipe everything away for this small lump sum amount, and then we're going to reduce your payment. And ideally, wanted to keep people in their homes and, like you said, get them performing again if possible. If that wasn't possible, sometimes they would do, and this is probably beyond the scope of today's show, but just to give folks, a little bit of an idea out there, sometimes people will call this like cash for keys, where they essentially pay people to go away, and sometimes will even get a moving truck for them and pay for their expenses because it's faster and easier for them to do that and just take back the home and do something with that than it is for them to go through the foreclosure process. So no matter what, ideally you want people to stay in their homes, but in some cases they did have to foreclose, which in and of itself is a pretty lengthy process. And then as we get further into the story here, obviously COVID threw a wrench into the mix, but that's essentially what they were doing. And so the appeal to the investors is, hey, I can do well by doing good. And also, I don't know, we're not going to get too far down the rabbit hole with this, but these funds were what they consider Reg A or Reg A plus funds, which, without getting super technical, basically means that they're under a securities exemption where they can raise money from a lot of different people, including non-accredited investors, which normally you don't see as much of in this real estate fund type of space. And they could invest with very modest amounts. We mentioned, I think my initial investment was $1,000. I don't remember what Cube's initial investment was, but we weren't putting in $1 gazillion into these things, at least initially, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about with these real estate note funds. And then the play, or the promise, if you will, in quotes, to investors is that we would get this preferred return, essentially. And so on the first fund, like Cube mentioned, it was 12% annualized, paid out monthly. And on the second fund that we both invested in, it was 10% annualized that was paid out monthly as well. And so that, in the scheme of things with the interest rates, like he mentioned, I'm not trying to repeat everything he said, but he's spot on. That was very, very attractive. So just think of like, this is something where, yes, it's an investment. Yes, there's an element of risk, but you can essentially park some money somewhere and do something that is sort of good for the greater good of humanity, if you will, and earn a decent yield on your cash. And that, I think, at least for me, and I probably can speak for Cube too, that's where we were looking at it and saying, all right, rates suck right now. This is a pretty good return. They've done it once. They're paying consistently. They're opening up a new fund. They're paying a little bit less, but this seems sustainable in worst case scenario. If they have to take back all the homes because they bought the loans at a discount, then presumably they can still make investors whole. And that's kind of where we are / where we were at that point in time. Anything you want to add there?
No, I don't think so. I guess that was kind of the initial stages of the investment, and like you said, I don't remember how much I put in initially, and then I kept adding to it once I saw they were actually paying, and then I kept adding to it. Then they opened a new fund, and I put money into that. Now I did, and I know that I don't think you ever did this. Whenever COVID happened, I guess hindsight's 2020. I should have taken it all out then, if possible. But I did take not a distribution, I guess a withdrawal from one of my accounts,
Redemption,
the one that was only given, redemption, I guess is what they call it. From the one that was yielding 10%. There was really no rhyme or reason to that other than COVID was happening. And I guess I felt like the investment was a little bit more at risk than it previously was, because everything kind of felt like it was at risk during COVID. I mean, there were days, the stock market just kept dropping 5% every day. And I kind of told myself, I was like, okay, if this is happening everywhere else, then how the fuck is this fund going to work out? It was more of like, if the smartest people in the world are worried and losing their ass, then maybe it would be smart for me to take some risk off the table. Knowing that they have limited liquidity, which we'll get more to that later.
Oh, boy.
But what?
I said, oh, boy.
But I did withdraw. I don't know. It was roughly, I will just say, 25% of the funds that I had spread across the two funds. I took them all from one fund, and I did get the money back. It probably took, I don't know, I can't really remember, probably 3 or 4 months. But it did get sent back, and looking back on it now, it was like, well, if you were worried enough to take that much out, then why weren't you worried enough to take more out, type of deal. But it is what it is at this point. So at least I took something out.
Meanwhile, Cashflow King's out to fucking lunch and leaves 100% of the money in to ride. And I don't care to get into some of the numbers because we actually put a number in the title of the show. So collectively, at this point, I think based on what we still have left in the funds, we're just north of about 160,000 together. Most of that, unfortunately, is on the Cashflow King side of the equation. So I put in. Actually went back and took a second take at these numbers right before recording the show to get some numbers down. But I had put in 20,000 or so into the first fund at 12% and invested or reinvested the very last or one of the very last distributions that I got from that fund. But for a while, I was actually taking cash distribution. So I parked the money there. I took the 12% rip. And then as I was getting the monthly payment from that, the monthly distributions, I was taking that and deploying it elsewhere. And so I was actually kind of surprised to see, and I don't know, this is, I guess, the consolation fucking prize for where we're at right now. But of the 20,000 that I invested, I had over 11 and a half or so that came back to me in cash distributions that I had reinvested elsewhere. And so that's a return on the investment, not a return of the investment. So that's the other thing that's nice is they're paying you that yield, that distribution, but your principal amount that you put in is still there as part of the account, and that's still money that they owe you. So quick math, if I took the difference between the 20 I put in and the 11 and change I got back, it was about $8,800 or so, the delta between the two, that if you want to look at it from that standpoint. But realistically, I still have an account there that's worth just over 20,000, and that's money that they still owe me. That's in the first fund at 12%. And then I got kind of greedy, especially with the second fund that launched at 10%. And you might remember when this podcast first came out a couple years ago, I think we started it in 2022, we had done different shows. Again, rates were very different at the time. They were much lower. And we were talking, I think we did a show about collateralizing assets and borrowing against your market-based or marketable securities type of portfolio. So, for example, if you had a taxable brokerage account, maybe you were buying some ETFs or mutual funds or stocks or whatever in there, you could actually loan against that for extremely favorable rates. I think at one point, when we were recording those shows, I could take a margin loan at like 2%, which basically means I could leave my money invested in that brokerage account subject to market fluctuations. And as long as I stayed within certain parameters, I could then borrow against that money, collateralize those assets at a 2% rate where I had to make interest-only payments, and I could carry that out as long as I wanted to. The risk was that that rate was subject to fluctuation. It was variable, right? But what I ended up doing at a couple different points was I would take a margin loan out at 2%, and I'd rip the cash into this particular fund at 10, and I'm making an 8% spread, which is pretty significant. You know, we talk about positive financial arbitrage, and that's what was happening at the time, which works great when things go well, but it can really get you in trouble. And as we've always said on those other shows, you have to really know what you're doing and be careful, because if things move against you, if rates run up and things like that, you can get in trouble pretty quickly. I'm happy to say that as soon as I saw the rates on those margin loans start to tick up, even just a little bit on the variable side, I didn't like it as much, and I actually went ahead and cleared those out. So fortunately, I do not have any margin loans out. I haven't had margin loans out for quite some time now, but that was one way that I was sort of accelerating or supercharging, if you will, my investment into this second fund. And in addition to that, when rates were super, super low, at one point, we actually did a cash out refi on our primary residence. And it wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was a decent chunk that I had pulled out. If I had just recast the loan and not taken any cash out, I think I could have locked a 30-year fixed at that time at about 2.5. But because I pulled some cash out, you know, the rate went up a little bit, so I locked a 30-year fixed at 2.99. Still effectively, in my mind, free money. Looking back, I wouldn't change that, right? But at the same time, my risk is greatly reduced. And I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but I was okay with doing that. Obviously, I wouldn't want to do that on a variable rate. So anyway, long story long, I started, quite frankly, getting a little bit greedy with this and just wanted to continue to pour gas on the fire. If you're going to give me a 10% rip to my face every month and I can take that money and either reinvest it or do whatever I want with it, I want to put as much money as possible in there. And if I can borrow it next to nothing at or below inflation long term, then why the hell wouldn't I do that? And so that's what I started doing at the time. And so on this second fund, I had invested, I'm looking at the numbers here, over $108,000 that I had invested. I had reinvested over 11.5 back into the fund. So I have at this point over $120,000 in that second fund at the 10%. I had also taken out just under $19,000 in cash distribution. So if you take the amount I invested in terms of principal, if you want to think of it that way, and then you back out the 19 or so that I had taken out in cash distributions and reinvested elsewhere, there's a delta there of just south of $90,000. So even if you just added up that plus the delta on the first fund, if all goes to hell in a handbasket, and we'll color the rest of the story in here as we go, it's going to be a total of about, over $98,000 down the tubes. But realistically, if you look at the value of the first account, which is over $20,000, and then the value of that second account right now that's over $120,000, I got over $140,000 in this thing. And I guess this podcast is maybe some sort of therapy session for me, but it's kind of crazy when you think about that's essentially at risk, and we'll talk more about that here in a couple of minutes. But anyway, that's how I got balls deep essentially in the second fund. I was still putting money of my own in, but I was also adding to that with the cash out refi, with some margin loans, with to bulk that up as much as I could, because I knew chances are 10% is not going to be something that's going to be there forever. They went from 12 to 10. What's next? Are they going to go from 10 to 8 or 10 to 7? And actually they launched new funds, and that's exactly what they did. But that's beyond the scope of today. So that's kind of where I was at. All right, Cube, where were we before I went down that fucking rabbit hole?
Yeah, so that is one way to look at it. I'm assuming I'm not getting any of my money back at this point, but at one point I did kind of look to see what the calculation was as far as how much money I had in it and how much I had gotten returned, because I do believe that I started getting my payments in cash and not reinvesting them a little bit earlier than you had, if memory serves me correctly. So I don't remember what those numbers were. This was months ago when I thought that it was going to be a zero, and now I'm almost certain that it's a zero. So I want to say roughly it's going to be about probably a 50% loss for me based off of the distributions that I got versus what I put into it.
All right, well, tell them, like, before we kind of did a spoiler alert there. Like, we think this thing's going fucking south, but, like, let's talk about, essentially why that is. So I guess the early warning signs.
Well, the early warning signs to me, like, looking back on it now, I kind of feel dumb for just taking out a little bit of it. Like, why didn't I try to get a bigger distribution then? Like, I don't really know the answer to that, I guess.
All right, here's my answer. It was like clockwork, pretty much. Like, within a handful of days, at the end of the month, the payments were made every single month. So whether you took cash distributions and reinvested them elsewhere, like in in the stock market, for example, or you reinvested within the fund, those distributions were coming out roughly the 20-something of every month. And that was consistent like fucking clockwork for the longest time. And then all of a sudden, it started getting delayed a little bit. And it'd be delayed a few days. Then it would be a week. Then it would be 2 weeks. Then they'd start paying on different days and different months. And it's like, well, wait a minute. What the hell's going on? That was the first, like, wait a minute moment for me. But because it was never precisely, it wasn't like they said, hey, we're going to pay you on the 25th of each and every month, and it's always going to be the 25th unless that falls on a holiday or, a weekend, then it's going to be the prior business day or the next business day, something like that. It wasn't like that. It was kind of all over the place. So for me, that was one of the early warning signs.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I remember telling you or asking you, like, where the fuck is our money at and everything. And I think looking back on it, like you said, there was probably something starting to happen at that point. This is just pure speculation on my part. But there was no rhyme or reason as to why, they kept coming up with things. Oh, we're changing our fucking software, or something got loaded and didn't download correctly, or there was always something. But I think that should have been more of a red flag that, okay, what exactly is going on here? Because it used to be pretty prompt payment within 1 to 2 days of each other every month. And then all of a sudden, like you said, it was a week or two later than normal. And then it was, it made me scratch my head a little bit at that point. Now, I don't remember when exactly that was happening. I don't know. I can't remember back to then exactly, but that may have played a role as well in me taking a little bit of my money out of there, because I was like a little suspicious as to what was maybe happening behind the scenes that we weren't being told.
And on the communication front too, every group /fund /syndicator /whomever is more than likely going to have investor relations folks. And communication is very important. There's some syndicators and funds that I'm in and with that their communication is just fantastic, and they are very prompt about getting back to you. With these folks, all of a sudden it was, well, wait a minute, it was an immediate response. Then it was, well, wait a few days. Then it was, I need to email you 3 fucking times and finally pick up the phone before I can get an answer. And even then, it's a half-ass answer. And so there were some things that weren't looking quite right, but at the same time, at that point, and again, I don't remember exactly when this was either, but at that point, the payments, the distributions were still happening, even though they were somewhat less frequent and less consistent than they had been in the past. So Cube Crusher was smart enough to start to take some chips off the table, where I just had my dick out and, that's what it was, and whatever, like, we got nothing to worry about. So essentially, that's what was happening, I guess, at that time. And, all right, so let's continue. What else?
Yeah, so it was kind of, I would say it was, I don't even know when COVID was, 2020, 2021 time frame when I had taken that distribution. And then fast forward to about, well, I guess what was it, the beginning of this year or what exactly?
Yeah, but, February is what I had in my notes from when distributions just completely stopped.
Well, I think there was a couple months where, like, they paid, like, let's say an October distribution in November or something like that, and then They were kind of like a month behind, and then all of a sudden they just totally stopped.
Yep.
So at that point, that's when I just assumed it was a zero. Yeah, or going to be close to zero, I should say. They kept saying, that we're going to pay him out, yada, yada. Meanwhile, they were behind the scenes doing all kinds of crazy shit.
Yeah, so they had like they would sell off some of these loans as well if they could make a profit on the loan, and there would be other groups, other funds, other shops that sometimes would buy from them. And then all of a sudden COVID happened, and then you had the eviction moratorium that happened, and all of a sudden now it was harder and harder to get people out of their homes if need be. And all of a sudden, you have so think about this: you have these loans that were delinquent to begin with, which is why you bought them at a discount, right? They're non-performing. And you're doing the best you can to work with the folks in these homes to get them back on track and get them making payments and get a return to the investors and that sort of thing. And then COVID happens and you can't evict anybody. And all of a sudden people start realizing, well, hey, wait a minute, fuck that. I don't need to pay shit. And you can't do anything about it. And depending on the states that these properties were in, again, this is kind of an across the country thing, all of a sudden, like, things got way backed up in certain states, pretty much all states, but some were worse than others. And now you have people that are not paying. So these loans went from non-performing to, in some cases, re-performing, and then all of a sudden fucking flatlined. And things get choppy. Everybody gets scared. Nobody wants to buy loans. And they were selling, a lot of them, when they were selling, a little bit here, a little bit there. And then I remember them telling us at one point that there was a large institutional buyer that pretty much wanted to essentially buy them out and buy all or substantially all of the loans. And so what they ended up doing around that time was putting some of those smaller groups on hold rather, and not selling them, even though those were kind of fewer and far between, to try to get everything ready for this big institutional buyer. And then all of a sudden at the last minute, that falls through. Right? So that just adds...
Allegedly.
Yeah, allegedly. That just adds to the fucking story. And so I'm going to skip down to the read the documents thing, and this is where this really gets interesting, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cube here in a second. But if I had to look back on this, and we'll get to lessons at the end, but I'm going to do a little quick spoiler again here in the middle. Read the documents. And we've said this before. Anytime you're thinking about making an investment with any firm, any group, any fund, any whatever, any investment, you should always be knowledgeable about what you're investing in and read the documents. Now, because we had some prior experience investing in these funds, right? We thought, okay, we've kind of tested them out. We did the large cheese pizza thing, right? We put some money in. We got some drips back. This looks good. All right, let's really start pumping it. And then all of a sudden, things start to go south. And so one of the things that I didn't realize at the time, and shame on me, and by the way, we're not looking for sympathy from anybody. We're simply trying to tell our story here and give you some real life lessons to hopefully help you not make some of these same mistakes. And hopefully we certainly don't make some of these same mistakes in the future. But I didn't realize that the funds could actually take on debt or use leverage in addition to investor money to buy these discounted mortgages. I completely missed that. Now, I actually went back and took a look at some of the documents, and there are different packets for the different funds, but in one of them, it was 5 sentences. In the other packet, it was about 4 sentences in like an 80-plus page document, okay? And one of the headings in those sections was borrowing and leverage policy. And it's, several pages in, kind of buried in the middle of the thing. And again, you should, I should, we all should read everything, but we know how it goes. When you update, your software on your phone, if let's say you have an iPhone and Apple says, bullshit, agree to our terms, yada, 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 and you just hit agree because you want to get back on your phone and you want to get back to doing whatever you were doing. In some ways, you can make an argument that it's kind of sort of like that. And so I just missed it. I had no idea. I thought that they were raising money from investors like us to take that money and turn around and buy these loans. I didn't realize that they threw something in there that said if they want to, they can also use up to, I believe it was 70% leverage and borrow money in addition to investor money to buy more of these loans. And so that was something that really threw a wrench into this whole fucking thing, and is one of the main reasons that, as we'll ultimately get to as we go through the podcast, we're in the situation that we're in right now, because, as we've said on the show before, leverage cuts both ways. And so that was something that was, I don't want to say buried in there because it was clearly disclosed, but shame on me for not recognizing that earlier and not picking up on that. Would it have changed if I had to go back, right? Hindsight's 20/20, like we said. But if I had to go back, would that have changed my decision on whether or not to invest in the fund? Quite honestly, especially looking back at the rates and everything else at the time, probably not. I probably still would have invested in the fund. However, I am embarrassed to say that I didn't realize that, and I should have. Shame on me, right? I've been investing for almost 2 decades now, and I didn't think to look at something so simple. So it was an oversight on my part that now very well could cost me, over $140,000. So anyway, Cube, what do you got?
Yeah, this is just my guess or my logical take on probably what happened with it was rates were low, things were going good, the fund was going well, and then that's probably about the time they decided to take on this leverage. But I'm 100% sure it was not any type of fixed rate leverage type of deal. And then we had the interest rates skyrocketed. I mean, the Fed hiked unprecedentedly. They've never done it that quickly before. 5 rate hikes in almost no time, which made interest expense probably a little bit more. I know from the most recent investor call that I was on, it sounds like they had used several properties / loans as collateral on their loan. And that's kind of when shit hit the fan. My guess is they started having some cash issues to pay the interest on these loans, and then at some point they put up the real estate in the notes or whatever as collateral to get some cash so they could pay some things off.
Yeah, so the interest rate environment changed, like you said, right? Rates skyrocket, credit starts to dry up a little bit, and all of a sudden the lender comes knocking and says, hey, we want paid. And that's, I think, when investors like us got pushed aside and those distributions stopped, and quite frankly, some of the fucking vendors that they were paying stopped getting paid. So all this shit's going on at the same time. Investors get pushed aside. The lender comes knocking and says, hey, we want paid. And it put a real squeeze on them, right? This is where shit gets real, as we like to say. So now they're trying to cut costs. They're trying to cut overhead. They're laying people off that work for the fund. They're only paying certain vendors, right? So if you're in an office building, you got to keep the lights on. You're probably going to pay your utility bill. But if it's something else that's quote-unquote non-essential, then maybe you don't pay them, right? And that's what was happening. So all of a sudden, shit gets real, and the lender comes knocking and says, hey, we want money. All right, continue.
Yeah, so that's when... You can beep that out.
I'll beep that out, yeah.
He basically said, hey, fuck you investors. I'm no longer going to pay distributions, which quite frankly, once I figured out exactly what was going on, I didn't mind. I'm like, I don't give a shit. Don't ever send me another distribution. Just give me my damn money back. And I think that slowly all the other investors that are on these calls are catching on, because previously they would be like, hey, when am I going to get my distribution for March? It's fucking September. I'm like, dude, I don't give a shit when I get my freaking $100 or whatever. It's like, I want my cash back. And it seemed like on this most recent call, everybody was kind of asking, okay, are we going to get our money back? So yeah, we haven't been paid since February, March, so 9-10 months, whatever it's been. And
by the way, before you drop the bomb, at this point, and maybe I'm just in denial, and I'm still hoping that somehow this is a bad fucking dream, but at some point, it just gets so bad that you just kind of throw your hands up and say, yeah, it's probably a 0. But at this point in the story, I'm thinking, you know what? Like, as soon as because he kept talking about what we have in assets and how much we owe the lender and da-da-da-da. And then all of a sudden, once we get them paid off, we're going to be able to get caught up. We're going to do redemptions. We're going to do this, that, and the other thing. And I'm thinking, all right, that could work. And they were making progress. We were on these investor calls that happened fairly often. And we were tracking the quote-unquote progress that they were making in terms of getting the lender paid. So our distributions were put on hold so that they could take all the cash that they had and essentially not lose everything to the lender. So now the lender needs to get paid, except Cube.
So this is
You can't
this
make
is
this
almost,
shit up, dude.
Yeah, this is almost unbelievable. When I watched the latest call, so yeah, he was talking pretty good or pretty positive the last 4 to 6 months. Which what would you expect him to say? Oh, we're fucked. Well, no, obviously he's not going to say that and cause a panic. But he was working towards paying off the debt, like you said, not worried about paying investors or paying off this debt. So the call that happened, I don't know, it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago now. He gets on there and said that there was an important update. So he paid back all of the loan from the lender. However, not only did he pay it back, apparently he fucking overpaid it to the tune of over $3 million. Because apparently he's got a real bookkeeping issues. And it gets a little complicated on how it works. So he has the lender was an LLC of or / subsidiary of a bigger, I can't remember the name of it even, something capital, that has various LLCs that loan to various places. I would assume that's what they do. I don't know exactly what they do. So anyway, he had this loan. He thought he, had paid back the lender or whatever. And meanwhile, the lender, he had given them a power of attorney, or I can't remember if he called it a limited power of attorney, or they had power of attorney, while his assets, or the fund's assets, I should say, they're not his, were collateralized against the loan. The company was able to sell, or they had power of attorney to sell those notes, it seemed to me. And they were doing so. So after explaining that, I was like, well, I could see where there could be a potential slight overpayment, but I don't see how you still get, because I don't even know the size of this fund exactly, but $3 million is a good chunk of change just to lose in accounting. But basically what he said was he was paying back the lender what he thought he owed. Meanwhile, the lender was selling off some of those assets that he wasn't even aware of for prices that he didn't even know what they were, and applying those to the loan as well, and therefore the loan ended up being overpaid.
See, I didn't get that last part out of it. My understanding, and I could be wrong, I went back to try to watch the replay after the live event. Like I told you, I had some tech issues with it. But my understanding was that the collateralized assets were being sold to affiliated companies after the loan was supposedly paid in full. So it's like you pledge something as collateral, you owe money to that lender, you then pay that lender, and then they say, yeah, well, fuck you anyway. And they take the collateral that you pledge and they start selling it to them, their buddy, their brother, their sister, and everybody else's LLC. That was my impression. Is that not spot on?
Right, so I believe that happened too. I don't know. I was under the impression that maybe some of them were like legitimate sales, like they were allowed to do that. But then at some point, the power of attorney was revoked, and this lender was still selling, like you said, was selling these notes to actually basically associated companies for less than what our fund manager thinks that they were worth. And that's where he thinks, I guess, is the strongest part of the lawsuit, or the multiple fucking lawsuits that this fund's going to have across multiple fucking states with multiple fucking companies to try to get our fucking money back.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at, right? So and by the way, the one thing I don't think we did mention yet is even after that overpayment or supposed overpayment was made to this particular lender, the lender was not cooperating in trying to reconcile the books, and they even went so far as to say, hey, our fund will pay for a fucking audit of your books because we strongly believe we overpaid you, and they still wouldn't agree to that. So it's pretty clear, at least it appears to be pretty clear, that there's some shady shit going on, like we just described, and this whole thing is a big clusterfuck, essentially.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. And now I will say, if all of what we are being told is true, God knows what the fuck could really be happening here. But yeah, for them just to not even allow them to look at their books or see what's going on, that's pretty fishy to say the least. So I did find that interesting. Obviously, like he mentioned, there's going to be so many lawsuits that are going to drag out for so long, and eventually they will get to look at the books or whatever. But
Yeah, but at that point, the question is there anything left? Like, can you stop them and prevent them from continuing to sell to all these other affiliated companies for non-arm's length transaction type of prices before we can get what we need through the lawsuit to take a look at the books and ultimately force them to give us or our fund what we're owed, which then in turn presumably would allow the fund to pay back investors, and whether or not they ever get 100% of their principal and or owed distributions is a completely different story. The answer is probably not.
right, yeah. I mean, my guess is that most of our investment is going to go to legal fees at this point. And hell, that may be the strategy of the lender, is to just bankrupt the fund through legal fees, essentially, to where it can't keep going and can't keep pursuing all the different, I don't know, he's talking a bunch of legal shit.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a definite chance the fund could run out of money before any of this stuff ends.
So it went from where we started with you guys, and all of a sudden, went through the story, and then distributions were paused, and then we had promising imminent sales, so we thought, and everybody was going to get their money back. And I remember talking with my CPA a couple years ago, 1 or 2 years ago, about, hey, if we get redeemed this year, let's do a little bit of planning. What does that look like for tax purposes and gains and whatnot? And now here we are, where it's like, hey, if we're lucky, we might see some of this years from now. Or, to Cube's point, the fund could run out of money, end up pissing it all away to legal fees, and we see zero. And that's kind of, I guess, where we're at. And I hope we're wrong. I hope we're dead fucking wrong. I know other people that are invested in these funds, and there's one person in particular who is still keeping the faith, which gives me a glimmer of hope, I guess, and thinks that somehow we're going to pull through. But I hate to say it, I don't agree with Cube on everything. I really don't agree with him on much sometimes, I feel like. But I'm starting to gravitate in the direction towards, you know what, he very well could be right, that this thing's a fucking zero. So that's kind of where we're at. So
yeah, it was just, I mean, it was almost unbelievable, the last call, too.
Yeah, I mean, it was
I mean, it was just like, he just kept going, and I was like, honestly, I don't know. It would be a pretty elaborate lie if he was just straight up lying to investors, but it's almost so unbelievable that it feels like he's just lying to us. And who knows? He's probably going to the strip club and making it rain with all of our investor dollars. Like, I mean, I mean, it's the craziest shit I've ever heard.
Yeah, I'd rather the money go to legal fees. Fuck him. So anyway, all right. So lessons learned, kind of coming around full circle here. I put a few bullet points down here, is that always read every single word of every single document, particularly when it comes to investing. And I know nobody, probably myself included, is going to do that. Like, how many people actually read the prospectus of a fucking mutual fund? Nobody does. Or a private placement. But especially when you're in these, types of investments that are not traded in the public markets per se, you need to be extra careful. And this is a perfect example of, why and how that is. Now, I will say, in his defense and the fund's defense, there are several other crowdfunding type of real estate related funds that have gone completely belly up already and are already at zero. And he's done at least what appears on the surface to be virtually almost everything he can to, continue to try to get investors their money back. This legal bullshit here at the end is definitely going to throw it into overdrive and drag things out even longer. So bullet point 1, always read every single word of every single document. The next one I have is, and this, again, these are not earth-shattering things that you don't know, but I think it's important for all of us to hear them, and that is, no investment is immune from some sort of risk. And I can't tell you the number of people. There's actually a podcast that I like quite a bit, and he, on his podcast, has some ads on there with this company that I've personally visited that I would never do business with. They are fucking horrible, and Don't even get me started on that. But he talks about one of their private lending funds and how they pay a fixed rate of return, and they pay on, I don't know, whatever it is, the first or fifth of the month like clockwork, and blah, 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 blah. And then he makes the comparison at the end of how that's so much better than a quote unquote bank account. Well, first of all, one of those is an investment that involves risk, and you can see how that could play out based on today's episode. The other one is a deposit product that is not really an investment. So you really can't, you got to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. And I think that's something that a lot of us are guilty of. Hell, we even said it in the beginning of the show, like we were looking around at alternatives. Now, we didn't say, well, this is a savings product. We knew there was risk. But ultimately, a lot of people, and I think us included, look at the rate, right? What can I get on these funds? And with no risk and interest rates in the toilet at the time, I might be able to get, if I'm lucky, 1%. Versus if I take some risk, maybe I can get 10 or 12. Fuck it, I'll take the risk, right? And it just depends on, it goes back to the whole risk tolerance and risk capacity and those sorts of things. And I hope I don't come off to the Real Talk Personal Finance audience the wrong way when I say this. We're not looking for any sympathy here. This really fucking sucks, but it's not going to change my life. I can promise you that. However, there were some people, and it really pained me to hear this, that were on these investor calls, one person in particular in the Q&A, and the guy was talking about how he needed his $10,000 back because he had medical bills. Quite frankly, that's probably money that never should have been invested in a fund like this in the first place. It's probably money that should have been in a fucking savings account. Or if you listen to the show, maybe it would be in an HSA. But, Anyway, so just be careful. Don't listen to people focusing only on a rate of return. And be very, very careful about investments that have a risk of loss versus savings type products, because they are absolutely not the same thing. Those are my big lessons learned. Cube, what do you got?
Yeah, I think that looking back on it, it was a dumb investment when I made it. Probably. I wouldn't say it was a dumb investment. It doesn't make sense towards how I want to invest. And I say that because essentially your return is capped. The return was capped at 12% or 10%. Yeah, okay, that was good given the interest rate environment and trying to diversify a little bit outside of the stock market. But looking back on it, and obviously I was thinking differently at the time, but it's like the first thing that I don't like about it is that capped return. Like, to me, if you want an investment that has some type of cap on the return of that investment, just fucking invest in a savings account, invest in treasury bonds that we've talked about, invest in some type of treasury, something like that. Yeah, would it have been, maybe I could have gotten 2% at the time on a 10-year treasury bond fund? Maybe, I don't even know. It was probably freaking lower than that. It was 1%. To me, looking back on it, the 11% difference between, say, I could get 1% on a bond fund. And obviously, a treasury bond fund has other risk. When rates went up, I would have got my face fucking kicked in and probably lost 50% of my money. But at the same time, I would like to think that when rates started going up and the bond fund started going down, I would have at least had the option to take that money out in cash and eat a loss to my face.
Yeah, you were liquid. Your favorite thing.
Right, and that goes to the second thing. The second reason why this investment doesn't make sense, and quite frankly, I will never invest in anything like this in the future. That's not investment advice, but
should be.
Is the illiquidity of it. Yes, there is an illiquidity premium for investments. I understand that. It makes sense. If something is not liquid, then you're damn right I better get a better return on it, or else what the hell's the point of it, type of deal. and did that illiquidity premium exist when I put my money into this? Yeah, I mean, I think that it did, somewhat compared to something similar that you could get elsewhere, as far as, trying to get bond-like returns, for a lack of a better term. But I've realized that that's something that I don't like. Like, you know what? Is my return going to be a little bit lower if I invest in a publicly traded REIT, or a REIT fund that's publicly traded, or an ETF, whatever? Yeah, I'm not going to get that premium, and yeah, I'm going to have to look at the price of it every day, fluctuating up and down. But yeah, I can get that money tomorrow if I want it out, as opposed to, yeah, I don't have to look at the price fluctuate up and down every day. And for some people, that's good.
It is. Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know what the hell's going on. Now, granted, if I owned a REIT ETF that owns 100 fucking REITs, I'm not going to know what's going on at each and every one of them, but it's way more diversified. And I mean, it's publicly traded, so crazy shit does happen to publicly traded companies, but I don't think that it would happen to the extent that it has with this fund. So those are kind of my two big things looking back on it. If you're going to invest, you're taking on risk. Why the fuck would you take on risk to an upside capped return? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, thinking about it. It didn't, I guess, at the time I wasn't viewing it that way, but, I'm more of invest in something for the long term and create what they call asymmetrical returns, meaning that your investment can only go to zero, but it can also go up 100x. Now, well, the odds of that happening are pretty damn slim, going to zero or going to 100x, but that possibility does exist.
It exists, but it's, in my opinion, it's kind of like a parlay bet, right? I mean, you're going to hit it every once in a while, but most of the time you're not. And I think I guess I do disagree to some extent here, so I'm just going to pipe in real quick. When I think about it, most people think about stock market returns, right? Not everybody has the cube crusher stock picking ability, right? And they just are, set it and forget it, broad-based index fund type folks. You're probably going to be looking at some sort of expected return on average annualized of about 7-8%, give or take a little bit. So when you see something in this environment that was significantly more than that 10 to 12%, all of a sudden, even if you're looking at it, like, I don't know. I think that's still attractive, even though for certain assets. Now, are you going to put all your money in something like that? No, you're not. But where I was looking at it at the time anyway was an investment that I was treating as a relatively short-term investment in nature. I think the time frame for these funds initially was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5 years. So in my mind, it was a place to park surplus cash that had a little bit of risk. I didn't put everything in there, but I could make a reasonable rate of return and then within 5 years redeploy wherever desired at that time. But I would disagree. I don't think that, I mean, obviously, saying this now, it looks like a fucking horrible investment, but hindsight's 20/20, like we keep saying. But I don't think it was a bad investment given what I wanted it to do at the time. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to 3x, my money or whatever in that 5-year period. And there's other investments that give you that opportunity. I get that, and there's some reason to do that. But I think for what I wanted it for, and presumably what a lot of people wanted it for, just given the sheer time frame of what the expectation was for how long they were going to have the investor funds, like 5 years or so, I think that's reasonable, especially at the time. Maybe not today when rates are where they are today in 2023 going into 2024, but I think at the time it was okay. And you seem to disagree with that in a big, big way. I think if I'm reading between the lines, your asymmetrical return is like crypto. And when I'm looking at it, like I'm looking at it and comparing it to just the broad-based market, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I necessarily disagree with I think I mostly agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying for me, as an investor and how I like to invest, looking back on it, it doesn't make a lot of sense based on how I like to invest, I guess, is what I should say. Yeah, I mean, the investment made sense back then because, or I wouldn't have made it, right? But it's like almost looking back on it, from 5 years, looking back 5 years ago, it's like, would I have done it again? I probably would have. I mean, I like to think that I get better at investing, or the longer that I'm in it and the more that I learn. But at that stage, I did what I did, but I still think that overall, for how I want to invest my portfolio, an investment like that makes zero sense at this point going forward.
Okay, so you're saying long-term investments, you want no cap and unlimited upside, regardless of the likelihood that you're going to realize that upside. And for anything that is not long-term in nature, that's short-term, if you're going to get whatever the yield might be, you're looking more for deposit-type products.
Yeah, I think so. That's what makes sense to me now. I guess maybe I'm smarter than I was then, or hell, maybe I'm dumber. I don't know, but I think especially now too, and a lot of it did have to do with the interest rate environment, and that's changed quite dramatically. I know that what was it? It was at the end of October, before the market has ripped everybody's face off going into the end of the year. The 10-year Treasury yield hit 5%. And when it hit 5%, it's gone down substantially since then, but that's a whole nother story. But, and I think going forward, I don't see rates going to where they were. They could, I guess, at some point, and I could be desperate for yield, but even at that point, I don't think that it's going to be part of my investment strategy going forward, due to the illiquidity of it, as well as having a capped upside. I don't mind being illiquid and being able to make $1 zillion, I guess.
Well, we'll have to save the rate part for the premium subscribers on the e-newsletter, because I have an opinion about that too. But
we're coming out with it's going to be 2024 predictions newsletter.
Oh, geez, here we go.
Bold predictions.
Bold predictions. So if you guys want that quarterly e-newsletter, hey, throw the show $3 a month, baby.
Premium.
Become a premium subscriber.
That'll make up for 160,000.
Yeah, quick. How many subscribers? You should do the math. How many subscribers do we need at $3 per month after fucking Buzzsprout takes their 15%? And oh, by the way, I took the first distribution from the show recently. By the way, and I wrote to them about this. This is kind of off on a side note here, but whatever. We're already going long. Might as well just keep going. Fucking PayPal charges a 3% fee, and they pass that along to the podcasters. So then they fucking got me for another 3%. So 18% is just vanished into thin air. And at this point, I would probably take an 18% loss on this fund, because I'm probably never getting my money back. But anyway, yeah, feel free to subscribe to the show.
Maybe we should get like a P.O. box or something, have people just send us cash.
I don't know if that's going to be a great idea. I'd rather them just subscribe to the show.
Fees. Got to save the fees.
And if
maybe set up a Bitcoin address.
Well, and that's why I've been using the money to basically just have it pay the monthly subscription for the show. It's just to host the show or whatever. They don't charge a fee for that. But I was like, you know what? I've never taken a dime out of the show. Like, I'm going to take a little distribution, and then all of a sudden they whacked me. So anyway, they're supposedly looking for alternative distribution methods for podcasters. But, the money goes back to the show. Hopefully you're using your new, or newer, I should say. We got it a while ago for you, but your headset, your microphone, and all that kind of shit. I mean, that's where the money's going, essentially. Oh, and then the gift cards, that cost me $100. But anyway, so where were we at here? Oh, so the whole illiquidity thing, I think, real quick, and then we'll wrap this up. I think that certain types of investments, like real estate types of investments that are illiquid, are good in a lot of ways for a lot of people, myself included, because like you said, you're not going to see the daily change in the price, and there's a tendency for people to go ahead and essentially stick with it, number one, because you're not going to see the fluctuation, but number two, because it's illiquid and you can't do anything about it anyway. And so for certain types of investments, I personally am still okay with that. I'm not going to say that I would never invest in something like this again. But what I would do is absolutely read the documents and be very, very careful around the language with leverage and them being able to borrow. In fact, I would probably prompt me. I'd like to think if I was going to invest or consider investing in a similar type of fund going forward, that even that 4 to 5 sentence clause, number one, I would find it because I would read every single word. But number two, when I did, that it would prompt me to ask additional questions about not just, you can go max 70% leverage, but what type of leverage? Is it fixed? Is it variable? Do you have certain trigger points? Like there's a whole plethora of things that I would probably ask the fund manager / syndicator / sponsor that I didn't even think to ask before because I completely missed the fact that they could even do that. And shame on me for that. So I guess we wanted to do the show just to bring this real life to you guys. And, even as somebody, like I said, that's been investing for quite some time, that, works in the financial services industry, this can happen to anybody. And so I guess my last thought on lessons learned, and it probably goes without saying, but you always want to have your safe money in a safe place and only take risks with investment capital that you can afford to lose. Like I mentioned, it really sucks that this is probably going to be a zero, but we're not losing the home. My retirement is still set. The other real estate investments are still doing, for the most part, what they're supposed to be doing. It's diversified enough that I'm going to be okay. But I really, truly feel bad for the folks that got invested in this fund because, again, it was a Reg A Plus offering where they could get in as non-accredited at such low minimums that they're putting money that they need for their fucking medical bills in there. And I just hate that for them. So let this be a lesson that before you consider investing in anything, seek information, read information, and if needed, seek advisors, and hope that your advisor doesn't miss it like I missed this thing for myself. And it's embarrassing to say that, but again, in the spirit of being vulnerable, I think it's important to articulate that to the listeners so that they and us and everybody can just learn from it. So that's where I'm at. You got anything else?
Hey, like Chamath said, we're in the arena trying shit. What's everybody else doing?
Wait, what? You say Randy Moss?
No, Chamath.
Who the fuck is Chamath?
He's a big investor. He used to work.
Oh, the poker dude.
Yeah.
Oh, the guy. Okay, the guy that plays super high stakes poker.
People were dogging him for losing his ass.
Yeah.
On X or whatever the hell it's called now, and he said he replied to the guy and said, "I'm in the arena trying shit. What are you doing?"
All right, I like that. We're in the arena trying shit. All right, we'll close with that. So come in the arena with us. Join as a premium subscriber. Check out the new series launching in 2024 called Get Your Money Right. We're going to have a weekly tidbit there for you, some action items that you can do each and every week to get your financial house in order. Thanks again for tuning into the show. Shout out once again to our newest premium subscriber, Brandon A. Thank you to those in Lowell, Mass., Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Boardman, Oregon. We will see you in the next episode, and no parlays.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.